Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus.
Hi, I'm Michael Gorman. I'm glad to be here. I'm the Raymond Brown Professor of Biblical Studies and Theology at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore.
Dr. Michael Gorman. Mike, good to see you. Welcome to Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you, David. It's always good to be with you.
I just always like hanging out with you, and we had a chance to do that this year at the Lanier Theological Library for just a little bit as you were doing some presentations there. And those presentations are going to be in a book, and we're going to talk about that book on another podcast. We'll link to that in the show notes coming up a little bit. So, Mike, how did you get started reading Greek?
Well, it's interesting. I was in love with French as a student in high school. Actually began in ninth grade, which was junior high at that time. And so I had this proclivity toward languages. I loved French. And then I started studying Spanish. And in the midst of those two studies, I became a believer in Jesus. I had not really embraced the faith as a younger person. So anyhow, I went off to college thinking I really want to be able to read. After reading the New Testament in English, I thought I want to read it in Greek. So my freshman year in college, somebody came around and said, "Why don't you study Greek next year?" And I said, "Okay, I will." And I started as a sophomore, and I took it every term for the rest of my college career, and all of my MDiv and PhD work worked on Greek. It was my love of French and Spanish that led me, and my love of Jesus that led me into wanting to read Greek.
Did those other languages help you in the study of Greek and knowing French and Spanish?
Absolutely. I mean, learning things about gender, which we don't have in English. You know, that certain nouns can be either masculine or feminine, or in Greek case, neuter. That there's certain grammatical terms that you learn in studying a language that you don't necessarily learn in English, even though they're not all that different. Words like participle or other grammatical terms that you might not study in English. Not that you couldn't, but you might not pay attention to them, but you have to pay attention to them when you're studying another language. So yeah, it definitely helped.
Yeah, good. Well, so for people sometimes who are coming from those languages, I wonder if it's a little bit easier for them if that's their first language, if they're studying Greek and they run into these kinds of things as well, rather than coming from English first. All right, today we're going to look at Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 in particular. It's part of what we has often been called the Christ hymn. Set up a little bit what's going on in this passage before we jump into chapter 2, verse 6.
Well, this is an interesting text. I often tell my students there's been more ink spilled on this text than on any other text in the New Testament.
Indeed.
You and I have both contributed to that splash of ink. It is a dense, theologically text. Every word is debated among scholars. Every phrase is debated, and yet it's beautiful and can be understood in a basic way by almost anybody who reads it. I refer to it as Paul's master story. I think it expresses a lot of his thinking about Christ, about God. We'll come back to that. About himself. He uses that sort of structure of humiliation or self-humbling leading to exaltation as a description of his own life, present and future, and of the Christian life, giving up one's rights, but also being exalted in the eschatological world. So it's poetic. Some people do call it a hymn. I go back and forth. Recently, I've been referring to it as more a poem for sure, but we don't know for sure if it was ever sung. But it certainly has that hymnic quality of being dedicated words to a particular God. And the thing about it is that you can't just extract it from Philippians and say it's a hymn or a poem. Paul either writes it or inserts it for a purpose, which is to illustrate much of what he says in the rest of the letter. The rest of the letter is a kind of unpacking of this poem in terms of his own life and the life of the Philippian Christians and the Christian life more generally.
Yeah. I remember Larry Totto referred to this as Jesus being a lordly example.
Yeah, one of the best articles ever written on this. Lordly example. He's not just someone to imitate, he's someone to obey because he's Lord, but he gives his example as that Lord.
Yeah. I like the way you put it back in a number of years ago in one of your early books on Paul about this being the master story. So let's take a look at 2 verse 6. The setup piece is 2:5 is often translated as something like, have this mind in you which also was in Christ Jesus, something to that effect. Then it goes into the poem proper. Hasin morphe theou huparkon, ukharpagman egesata taine isa theo. Tell us a little bit about that poem, about why you think, and I'm fascinated by your idea that participle huparkon has this causal value to it.
Well, I know we're not talking about 2:5, but I want to start there very briefly and say there's a phrase in the middle of there, en humin, which I think is referring to the community. So I translate it, have this mind in you or in your fellowship among you, it's plural, which fellowship or Hawkeye can mean sort of like id est, have this mind in you that is in Christ Jesus. That is to say, which in your fellowship is a fellowship in Christ Jesus, who, and this is where it becomes important, who we have this participle, huparkon, which any beginning student of Greek knows when you study participles, you have to figure out their function. We could simply translate it being, so who, being in the form of God, but participles in their context have usually a nuance to them. And you study Greek grammars and you learn that a couple of options here, while being in the form of God, although being in the form of God, or perhaps because of being in the form of God. The standard is in almost every translation in English is something like though or although being in the form of God. In other words, although he was in the form of God, he did such and such. That's the standard translation. That's the standard interpretation. That's what I think is partly correct, but also partly, I won't say incorrect, but partly inadequate. What I would argue, and I have argued in print in a couple of places, is there is in the study of grammar, there's a field of study called transformational grammar. I don't buy into that field completely, but it does offer us some interesting language. It offers us the language of surface structure and deep structure. So the surface structure of this text is as we read it, we see that there is something antithetical. What Jesus was and what he did are completely unexpected. Although he had this high status, he emptied himself, he humbled himself, and so forth. And yes, there is a truth to that contrast between what he was and what he did. We might call that the surface structure, well, the surface form. At a deeper level, as we explore Paul's theology, we recognize that in this text, he's not simply saying, although Christ was something, he did something different, but also what is being manifested in that self-emptying, self-humbling is, in fact, the meaning of the form of God. That is to say, he did what he did not only because from our point of view, it looks like something a God would not do and should not do. But also he did what he did, in fact, because that's what it means to be God, to be self-giving, to be self-emptying, if you will. And I think a way to think about this in terms of other texts is to connect it to 1 Corinthians, where Paul says that Christ has become for us the wisdom and power of God. In other words, Christ embodies divine attributes, specifically named their power and wisdom. When we look at this text, we see not only the contrast between what would be expected normally of a divine being, namely self-glorification or seeking power, seeking glory, but we see the opposite of that going on, which is in fact the manifestation of true divinity.
Which itself is unexpected.
Unexpected. It's counterintuitive. Exactly.
Right.
So we have on display here a counterintuitive manifestation of Christ, but also, therefore, because he's in the form of God, an unexpected, surprising, counterintuitive revelation of who God is, the God of Israel is. Some people want to say, oh, Gorman, you just want to have your exegetical cake and eat it too. But if you're willing to at least suspend for a moment the disbelief in the possibility of two meanings, if we simply leave aside for a moment the although standard interpretation, we can look at a variety of people who've already argued elsewhere, in addition to me, major scholars who have also argued for because here, and also in 2 Corinthians 8:9. I'm thinking of John Barclay, for instance, who argues for 2 Corinthians 8:9, because he was poor. Not only although he was rich, he became poor for our sake. Because he was rich, he became poor for our sake. And coming back to our text, Stephen Fowl and to your right, the late Charlie Moll, CFD Moll, all have argued for because, but their work hasn't gotten on this passage maybe as much attention as it should.
I think one of the more recent translations I read from you said, although and indeed because he was in the form of God.
Yeah. So I want to keep them together. Yeah.
So there's a concessive idea with the although, but there's also a causal idea because this really indeed expresses the heart of God.
Yeah.
The self-giving and such.
Yeah, the more technical terms, a temporal interpretation of the participle, a concessive, although, or a causal, and I'm arguing for an emphasis on the causal, but not losing track of the concessive.
That's a great reading of that text, Michael. Thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Dr. Michael Gorman's upcoming book is entitled Paul and John in Sync. It's a brief book, but it makes a great case for how similar the theologies of John and Paul really are. If you're interested in studying Greek, you don't have to start with French and Spanish the way Dr. Gorman did. You can go directly from English, and that means going directly to the show notes to see how you can study Greek and Hebrew at Wheaton College, the best place I know to dig in. Whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, they have a path for you. It's time to get off the fence and get on the path. Thanks to my impressive wife, Kathy Capes, for her excellent job in editing this podcast. Thanks to John Lonsma, Rebecca Larson, and Jesse Dugan for their help in producing this week's episode. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. The goal of Exegetically Speaking is to promote the study of biblical languages. We trust you're feeling motivated. If not, there's always next week. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.